Aloha, it's Robert with Blue Planet. This video is an honest look at inflatable boards and the pros and cons compared to hard boards of inflatables. I'm also going to talk about a survey that we've done and the results of the survey, as well as different construction options for inflatables and some of my recommendations. You know, there's a lot of videos out there on inflatables. What I found though is most of them are basically marketing videos for inflatables, so it doesn't really give you a good neutral look at the pros and cons. So let's start with the pros of inflatable boards. So to me, the biggest advantage of having an inflatable board clearly is the portability, like being able to just deflate it, roll it up, pack it up in a small backpack, take it on your back, take it on an airplane, ship it easily, so you can order it online and have it shipped to you. You know, there's a lot of advantages of having a smaller package to take with you, to put it in your trunk, to store it for the winter, things like that. So for someone that's limited space or doesn't have roof racks and so on, that portability is a big plus. The other thing that iSUP's are very good for are durability, especially impact resistance. So if you're paddling in a river with rocks or a rocky shoreline, or you have to launch somewhere where there's rocks or a dock or things like that, the inflatable board is just a rubber surface that bounces off anything like that. So a hard board with epoxy and fiberglass is much more likely to get chipped or scratched. So for durability, in terms of impact resistance, iSUP's are much better than hard boards. They're also soft, so they're kind of forgiving. If you fall onto your board, it's a lot of beginners tend to fall onto their board instead of into the water. For that, an iSUP is definitely safer because it's soft. There's less chance of hurting yourself on impact if you hit the board. So also for kids and parents liking, wanting their kids to be safe, that makes a lot of sense to have a board that's soft and forgiving if you fall on it, so it doesn't hurt you. So just in case you're wondering how much I know about inflatables, to tell you the truth, 99% of the time I use hard boards. Whenever I'm here in Hawaii, I have a lot of choices to use. Obviously, we have our whole demo fleet from our shop, plus my personal boards. For racing, surfing, foiling, all those sports, I definitely prefer hard boards. The performance is just much better. But I have used inflatable boards extensively. We've been building inflatable boards for the last 8 years or so. And I've gone through the whole Grand Canyon on an inflatable board for 16 days, through all the rapids and everything. There's a video linked below if you're interested in looking at that. I've also taken an inflatable board with me to Iceland on a trip. So when I'm traveling, I do like to use inflatable boards for that kind of use. But I know that the performance is not going to be the same as my hardboard, and I don't expect it to be. But for certain uses, the inflatable boards are the right tool for the job. Okay, so next let's look a little bit at the cons and negative sides of inflatable boards. And other than just the performance difference, I would say the biggest negative downside of using an inflatable board is having to pump it up. It's just kind of a drag when you get to the beach. You can't just grab the board, throw it in the water, and start stand-up surfing or paddling. You do have to pump it up first. And if you have a good pump, it's not that bad. Some of the cheap inflatable boards unfortunately come with really junky pumps, and it can be a pretty tough job to get it up to full pressure. You should really use it at least 15 psi or more to get it to be rigid enough where you can paddle it and have decent performance on it. So the pumping it up can take a while. We do have options. We have an electric pump with an internal battery. That's a great tool, but it's not cheap either. But once you have it inflated, you can actually use it as a fully inflated board, and you don't have to deflate it and inflate it every time. And actually, from our survey, we found that almost half of the people keep their board inflated and store it inflated, which is also better for the board because every time you roll it up, it kind of creates creases and so on, and can cause issues with the fins peeling off and things like that. Okay, so another big difference when comparing inflatables to hard boards is the stiffness. So there's big differences between inflatables in terms of stiffness, and I'm going to get into that later with the construction. But even the stiffest inflatable boards is going to be quite a bit softer and more flexible than a hard board. Especially carbon fiber hard boards are very rigid, very responsive, and you can feel that difference in the water, especially in high performance kind of conditions in waves, or when you're racing, or the water's kind of choppy. You can definitely feel the inflatable flexing. Even the stiffest inflatables, you're going to notice that flexibility. And especially in high performance kind of conditions like racing, or if you're surfing on a wave, if you step back on an inflatable, what happens is the rocker kind of flattens out, which is kind of the opposite of what you want. You know, so it makes it not as easy to turn. It's just not as responsive as a hard board. So in choppy conditions, the board can feel a little bit wobbly too to some people. It doesn't feel as stable as a hard board in some conditions. But that said, in flat water conditions, a good inflatable board can be very close in performance to a hard board. If you're cruising or racing in flat water, you know, it actually can be very hard to tell performance-wise the difference between a hard board and an inflatable board. Okay, so another big downside of inflatable boards, in my opinion, is the shape of the rails and the shape nose to tail. So the inflatable boards are made with drop stitch construction. Right now, that's basically the only technology available. And the drop stitch is basically has these fibers running from the top to the bottom, so you can make it in different thicknesses, but the thickness is all the way through from nose to tail. It's the same thickness. And the rails are rounded rails connecting the top to the bottom, basically. They can't be shaped. It's just a fat, round rail, and it's the same shape on the nose. It's the same shape on the tail. And so as a shaper, really the only thing you can influence is the outline of the board and the rocker line of the board. When they build it, they can kind of build in the rocker. They can, you know, cut the outline out. But the rest of the board, like, you can't taper it nose to tail. You can't shape the rails. So for surfing, it just having a big fat rounded rail in the surf just doesn't work that well. So, you know, having that rounded rail in the tail is definitely not a great thing for surfing. You want to have a thinner, sharper rail that can carve into a turn. You know, having a thinned out sharp rail helps a lot. It lets the water release easily off the bottom surface, and some brands put a sharper edge kind of glued onto the rail of the board, and that does help with the water release, but you still have that high volume rail that's just harder to push through the turn. So for surfing, I think there's no question that no inflatable board gets close to performance of a hard board. Yeah, so if you're going to surf, you know, unless you're traveling and you need a small travel board, just surfing it's you know, you can get close maybe to performance wise of a big fat board, but if you want a thinner shaped rail, it just doesn't work well on an inflatable board. So there now are some options for inflatable boards for foiling as well, so which I think is kind of a cool concept, because the foil packs up pretty small. If you can pack up the board pretty small too, then again you have a nice package that you can take with you on trips. But same thing, that flex is doesn't really help, you know, because you do have to push down on your front foot, push the foil down, and if you have flex, I haven't really tried it, to be honest, on an inflatable foil board, but to me it seems like you know, foil boards are fairly small, so if I'm traveling, I could take a foil board with me, and I would take a hard board. So once again, performance-wise, in flat water, for cruising and so on, inflatables can be a great choice, very similar in performance. Some beginners probably won't even notice the difference very much, but if you're surfing, then definitely you give up some performance in an inflatable board. You know, another downside can be the risk of deflation. Like, basically, you know, inflatables are very tough for blunt force impacts. Rounded rocks and so on won't damage it at all. But there is a risk of the board getting punctured, or, you know, very sharp rocks or sharp objects can puncture the skin. And then if you have a puncture in the board, obviously the board will deflate. And some boards now have like a double chamber technology, which is can be helpful for that, because you don't sink, you know. But if you're out in the ocean, something punctures your board. There's actually a video, I'll link to it below, where a guy in Alaska, you know, he's filling up his water bottle under a rock, and somehow it bumps into a sharp rock, and his board starts deflating, and you can see him kind of panicking, and his friend on a kayak tows him back, and he's like holding on to the puncture so the board won't deflate, and then, you know, he had to fix it. So, you know, that is a risk, and if the water's freezing cold, you don't really want to have your board deflate out in the ocean or in the water. So yeah, so the longevity is kind of a question mark, and that brings us kind of to the survey. The reason I started that survey is because in our shop, you know, we see firsthand that people coming in with inflatable boards from various brands, some of them big name brands, some of them cheap, inexpensive brands, but we've seen people bringing their boards in, and once the seam kind of comes apart or the board leaks at the seam, it's pretty much impossible to fix it. Like the boards come with a repair kit, and those patches, PVC patches, if you put it on well, it can seal a puncture very easily, and it's fairly simple to fix a board that has a puncture. But if the seam splits and the air is leaking out of the seam, that's a whole different story, and it's very technical to repair. We're not able to repair. We don't even know anybody that's willing to repair seams. So if you have a board, and the other thing is, if you repair a seam that's popped, and usually it's kind of weakened everywhere, so then it'll just pop somewhere else the next time you use it. So I don't know if it's really worth it to fix a seam that's leaking. So, but if you buy the board from a reputable company, they will usually replace it for you if something like that happens. So that's why it's important not just to go for the cheapest board you can find, because, you know, the other thing I would say that's a con is the environmental impact. Obviously, you know, if you have a board that you don't use much, or, you know, and it gets damaged and leaks air and you can't use it anymore, the whole thing ends up in the trash, and it's a lot of petrochemical stuff that you end up having to throw away. So, you know, take that into consideration too, and, you know, buy a quality board over just a cheap board that you can find online. Most people are quite happy with their inflatable board, so overall I would say, you know, don't hesitate to buy an inflatable board. I think especially if the type of use you're using it for, if it's good use for you, then inflatable boards are great. One thing I would say is that if you're in a hot climate, then the inflatable boards will deteriorate more quickly. So you should be aware of that, especially don't leave the inflatable board out in the sun. You know, heat also expands the air inside, and that can damage the board, make the seams pop and so on. Rolling it up also over time can damage the board. So, you know, keep those kind of things in mind. But overall, you know, most people are happy with their inflatable boards. The big brands are good about replacing boards that have issues. So other things in our survey were that, you know, like I said, almost half of the people keep their board stored inflated. So that means they don't really take advantage of that portability unless they do have to put it away for the winter or they go on a trip. Then it's great to have that portability, but a lot of times they end up storing it and keeping it fully inflated, which makes it a lot easier to use. I'll have a link below to the survey results, so check out the survey, and if you own an inflatable, please fill out the survey as well. So the more results we get, the more owners answer that survey, the more useful it is to people looking at it. So please go ahead and check out the survey and answer it if you haven't done that already. Okay, so next I'm going to go into a little bit the different construction options available. There's some brands, like for example Red Paddle Company specializes in inflatable boards. That's all they do. They've put a lot of thought into the engineering the boards and the construction and so on, and also marketing and everything else. So and they're concerned about their brand image and so on. So they will back up their boards, just as like other big brands like Starboards and other brands that they care about their reputation. So if you buy a board from a brand like that, just being able to get servicing, you know, Blue Planet obviously I would include in that list as well. We take care of customers. If there's an issue, we'll take care of it, you know, even if it's past the warranty date. If it's something that's manufacturing related, if you're working with a good brand, they should be able to take care of it. So that's something you don't get when you buy a cheap board that only comes with like a 30-day return guarantee or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about the different construction options. There are a lot of ways that companies have tried to make the boards more rigid, stiffer. And actually I talked to Todd Bradley from C4 Waterman. C4 was one of the first brands to have inflatables on the market. And they actually were the first to try the battens in the rails to stiffen the rails. And they found it didn't really help much. It wasn't really worth the effort to put those in there because it didn't make much of a difference. So, but Red Paddle Company does use those battens, and they say it makes the boards up to 40% stiffer. So, you know, but you know, you might want to check that for yourself and see how much of a difference it really makes. I guess it does make a difference, and maybe noticeable difference, but it still doesn't make the board as rigid as a hard board, obviously. There's also other options for stiffening the boards, like battens on the top or bottom, the materials used on top and bottom, stringer, kind of roll-up stringers used. Starboard also has like a string that you can tighten around the bottom of the board, which is supposed to keep the rocker line stiffer. So there's a lot of things. Starboards also has a double chamber now, which is kind of like an I-beam chamber inside the board. It's supposed to make it more rigid. And also, you know, one thing I like about that is the safety factor of having a two-chamber construction. If one deflates, you still have the other chamber to get you back to the beach if you need it. The other thing is the quality of the construction itself. The really cheap boards that are made with a single layer. It's just that the drop stitch fabric with one layer of PVC. Those boards are quite light and inexpensive to make, but the downside is they have a lot of flex, and they also can't handle a lot of pressure. So when you pump them up to a higher pressure, or then the sun, they warm up, those two layers can actually separate, and your board blows up. So single layer construction I don't recommend. Unless you want something just a toy for playing around in the water a little bit. The better construction is two-layer construction, where there's two layers of PVC. Makes the board much more rigid, much more durable. It does add weight. Some of the newer technology is the fusion, where they basically fuse the two layers together, saves on weight, and you have the same strength as the double-layer construction. So look at the construction. Also, the way the seams are glued on the rails. You know, they have like the high temperature sealed rails now, which supposedly hold up better over time. The construction makes a difference, and that's why some boards are more expensive than others. Okay, so you know, to kind of summarize it, inflatable boards are more durable for blunt impact. They're transportable, compact, portable. Those are great advantages. The disadvantages are more flex. The shape isn't as good, less performance for certain things. In terms of the quality of the board, there's differences. You know, I buy from a reputable brand. We actually decided that our strength is hard boards, so we're actually discontinuing our inflatable boards. The remaining stock we have, we're selling right now for $5.99, which is a great deal. So check it out if you can score one of those. But we decided to phase out our inflatable boards and just focus on our strengths for now, which is hard boards. So maybe in the future, when the technology improves, we will look at it again, maybe making inflatable boards. But for now, we're focused on hard boards at Blue Planet. And but you know, I do like inflatable boards for certain uses. I'm not saying that inflatable boards are no good. For, you know, especially for cruising on flat water, it's a great option. And I definitely wouldn't write it off, and it's a great technology. So and I think we'll see a lot of additional development in the future. If you're surfing, if you want performance, if you want a board that's fast and performs well and is responsive, stiff, for those kind of things, really your only option is a hard board, in my opinion. Okay, so I appreciate you watching this whole thing. It's kind of long. And subscribe down below. Give us a thumbs up if you like the video. Always appreciate it, and see you on the water.